Okay, so we've got our back block here. When you're doing an A-line skirt, you need to start with the back block because it's got two darts. When you pivot those down, they're going to swing the side seam out more than the single dart in the front. So start with the back, and we'll just actually, as a little bit of preparation, what we'll do. I'll just mark these with pencil first. What we need to do is we need to have a little mark at the hip line. So what I've done is I've got the center of the dart here and gone down through the end of the dart in a straight line, and then we'll take that down and we'll mark the hem as well. Okay, so there are two reference points, and the same thing on the side dart here. So center of the dart, down through the end of the dart, put a mark on the hip line, and then just another mark on the hem there as well. Okay, so they're the reference points that we can use. Now I'm going to do this in pen because it's easier to see, and we'll see how that goes. Hopefully I won't make too many mistakes. Okay, so the first section we have to trace out is the center back and the center back of the waist. But when I start drawing, I'm actually going to start from that point that I put down here on the hem. So mark that little point down the hem. Oops. Usually would never pattern make with a pen, but I need you to be able to see it. Okay, so I've just gone along here, and then I've marked that center of the dart there. Sorry, the center back arm of this center back dart. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pivot instead of pivoting from the bottom of the dart here, I'm actually going to pivot from the hip line here, because this will give us a straighter shape. Because you can see if I do it from the hip, this is why we ended up with that sort of more bell shape. So if you do it from the bottom of the hem, we end up here, so we've added that much extra fullness into the hem. Whereas if you pivot from the, just take it back there. If you pivot from the hip line and close this dart at the top there, you can see we're only increasing it by this much. So there's half the amount, which means that you get a more fitted A-line. Okay, so just putting it back in position again. Let's go through that again. So we've drawn around here to this point. We've pivoted from the hem so the center back dart closes. And now we just have to do the next section, which is this. So we go from this dart arm out to the side dart arm. And we also want to just put a reference line along the bottom there. So we're just that next section between the two marked points. Okay, so now I need to get rid of this dart. So I again put the pencil down on the hip line, and you can see here, see how this dart at the waistline, I'm swinging that around so that closes that dart. And then I can do the side seam, or the rest of the waist, the side seam, and just to here, this last little section here. Okay, and I'll also, while I'm here, I'll just mark the hip. Go back and do this one as well. So it's good to have those reference points. And you can see how the waist has got smaller and the hem has got bigger. See the contrast. Whereas with the other version that I did, where I pivoted from here, it would be, like this much. So, like it's right out to here. So it's a much more fitted through the top section here and less at the bottom. So now I just need to redraw the curve of the hem. Oops, that didn't show very well. There we go. You can see a nice smooth line there. And that's our back section done. Okay, so we've got our back panel here. So I've added 6mm seam allowances around all edge. Because this is half scale, it's easier to manage a smaller 6mm seam. And even though it is half scale, usually you'd add 5mm seam, but so a 6mm is easier, like as a reference point on a sewing machine. And I've only added 6mm to the centre back and the side seam as well. If you're having trouble with 6mm, add a centimetre, that's fine. And this is only like a 6mm hem I put on here as well. But if you were doing this full scale, obviously you'd work with a 4cm hem or something. Okay, so just keep those seam allowances in mind when you convert your half scale back to a full scale again. Okay, and something I didn't mention before either is that because I've pivoted from the hip line, it means that the hip line of the skirt stays the same as the straight skirt, and we don't add a lot of fullness through there. So that's what makes it give you a neater fit around this upper section from the hip to the waist. All right, so we're going to start doing the front skirt, but what we need to do first is we're going to draw a line. So this will ultimately be our centre front of our new skirt pattern. But what we need to do, because we had 2 darts at the back and we've only got 1 dart at the front, you know how I said there was going to be the 2 darts would create more fullness into the hem. And if we don't take that into account when we pivot this one out, like our side seams will be on different grain lines, which means that they'll be harder to sew and one will stretch and then the front one will twist around towards the back. So what we need is a reference line used from our back pattern to help us create our front pattern. So all you need to do is just put your pattern. It doesn't matter whether you use the centre back line or the raw edge here, and we just need to draw a line on our paper that is the side seam there. Okay, so that's our reference line, and again it doesn't really even matter where that sits in the paper, but like from the hem up to the hip is a good reference line to use. Okay, so now we're going to start getting rid of our darts in our front pattern here. So actually, before we do that, we need to put in our reference points. So we're going to measure halfway between the dart. It's where that point is. That's pretty easy to get. Through the end of the dart, draw a line down to the hip, and then one down to the hem. So there are our 2 reference points going through the dart, because that point on the hip is where our pivot point is. Okay, so just put this on the line. So we'll go from our centre front out to the dart, put a little reference mark there, and then go down, and then we'll do the hem as well, out to our reference mark, and then find our point on the hip line and use that as a pivot point to close the front dart. Okay, so now we'll just sit that in position for a second, and you can see now how the side seams are different angles, which means that they're going to be on different grains. I'll just put a line there as a reference so it's a bit easier to see that. So what we want to do is we want to add a little bit more fullness into the front hem so that our side seams are on the same grain. So what I'm going to do now is, I've already got one there, that's the one a mark I prepared earlier. Halfway between where the dart is and where the side seam is, just put another little reference point, and this is going to be our pivot point. And what we're going to do is, even though we pivoted from the hip before, we need to, what we're going to do is, even though there's no dart in there, we're just going to use this point as a reference point at the top. We can't pivot from the hem because that'll make our side seam shorter. Okay, so we have to pivot from the top there, and we're just going to swing that out until the side of our front skirt is on the same angle as the side of our back skirt. And once we've got that point there, we can now go from our point down the bottom, up the side, just marking the hip line as a reference, around up to the waist, and I actually didn't mark that last little bit in there, so we'll just connect those two. Okay, so you can see now we have added a little bit more onto the hem here, and maybe that means that the side seam, when you do the toile, will need to be taken in slightly here. But you've seen, as you saw on the dummy before, it's not that much of a difference. Okay, so then we just need to take our side seam back. So we've swung that up so it's still square at the side there and square at the center front. We've got our hip notch here as a reference point. We can have a reference point for our hip at the center front here. And now we just need to add seam allowances to it, and the center front, the same as the block, the center front will be center front on fold. So center front on fold here, so this will be a whole piece. So now I'll just add seam allowances around the waist, the side seam, and a hem, and that will be our piece finished. Okay. So we've got our piece here. What we're going to do now is just quickly add seam allowances. When you're adding a seam allowance, actually before we do, we've got our guidelines here, so we're going to rub those out to save any confusion along the way. It's our side seam. So again, like our back panel here, we're going to add 6mm seams to this piece. And what you do is you find the 6mm line. So each of these little sections here is 2mm coming up to the 1 centimetre. So just count 3. And then because the grading ruler is clear, you can actually see the line underneath. So you just need to sit the line underneath the line of the pattern, underneath the line, the 6mm line on the edge here. And so I can draw up to here because that's parallel. So that's a straight line. So I don't have to measure like this because I'm using my grading ruler. And the more you use it, the quicker it will be and the more sense it will make. Now from the side here, what I do is do the same thing. So put the 6mm line on top of the line underneath, and you can see, maybe you can't, do you want to get in there? You can see that? Yep, so you can see how it starts to go off down here. So we're going to go just down to that point where it starts to, where the line starts to swing off, and then we twist the grading ruler around, so the grading ruler, and you keep following that line until it starts to change direction, and then you twist around, and so you can add a really nice even line there. So same on the waist, so I'm putting it on the side there, and with sometimes, like this is quite a little curve, so I can only go 5mm before I turn before I start twisting the shape around. And the same on the hem. So again, this is a 6mm hem because it's a half scale pattern, but on a full scale that hem would be bigger. But generally around curves you have a smaller hem allowance anyway. So there are seam allowances added. We've transferred, always good to, well, you always should transfer your notches from the actual stitch line onto the raw edge, so that can be cut when you start sewing. What I also do too is, because this is going to be on the fold, so indicate and say center front cut on fold. Probably can't read my writing there. Center front cut on fold, to make sure that you don't cut out, you don't cut along that line there, because that could be very annoying. And then the last thing I would do here, apart from labeling it, so I'd do the label same as this: fitted front skirt block, front, cut 1 on fold, half scale, size 10. So that would go onto here. And then the final thing that I would do is just at the center front there, because you're going to have to put a waistband here or a lining or a facing or something, you need a reference point on your fold line. So what I do there is just a little T that comes out. So just like I did a little T here, this one comes out at a diagonal, so that I know, because if you mark it down this way and then cut along that line, you've lost it anyway. So I come at a diagonal, that little T there, so I know that that center front should have a notch. And there's your final pattern piece for your A-line.